Well, welcome to another Friday night. I want to do something a little bit different tonight. When we started React, or when I started React 8 years ago, I had developed at that point 50 characteristics of complex trauma. And then 5 years ago, I went to film a series on the 50 characteristics. And by the time I got into the series, I realized that it was going to be 60 characteristics. So that was 5 years ago. And if you know me at all, you know my brain is constantly researching, learning, looking for anything else that's going to help people with complex trauma understand their complex trauma. And so over the last 5 years, I've accumulated a few more characteristics of complex trauma. I won't tell you what number I'm at this point, but what I want to do tonight is look at one of those characteristics that we haven't really talked about in detail in the past and just develop it for people and hope it's helpful to them. And it's what I would call brain fog. It's a common characteristic for many that come out of complex trauma. They can be super sharp mentally. They can be very gifted mentally, academically, quick thinkers. But once in a while in their life, something is going on, and all of a sudden it's like their brain stops working. They go into this brain fog. They can't think clearly. And it's a very frustrating thing. It's a very confusing thing for people. Why does that happen? That's what I want to look at and hopefully give a few practical tools that will just help you if you struggle with this. So somebody has written this. Mental fog isn't a medical condition per se. However, it is a widely recognized term used to describe a notable decrease in cognitive functioning and a feeling that your brain is not operating as it used to. Some of the symptoms include problems with memory and word recall, lack of alertness and energy, and an inability to concentrate or find focus. In short, people experiencing mental fog struggle to find mental clarity in the same way that we find it difficult to see our way through an actual fog, where things are murky and feel labored. On a physical level, the condition can cause flagging energy levels, headaches, inflammation, including inflammation in the brain, and sleep issues, either insomnia or conversely, feeling sleepy all the time. In terms of mental functioning, people can become easily confused, anxious, and as a result, start to withdraw as they struggle to form or maintain emotional attachments. So it starts as brain fog, but then people begin to realize they're not thinking clearly and they start pulling away from people, away from attachments, so it starts to affect relationships. Most importantly, people of any age can experience mental fog, which quashes the stereotype that this only affects those who are old and dotty. So, brain fog again is a person who is normally very mentally sharp, but all of a sudden they aren't as sharp as usual. So they feel numb, they feel everyday activities are difficult now, take effort. There's a foggy haze that makes it difficulty to think or plan or remember. So it can get called the chemo brain or the fibro fog or some other terms that are used. It's important to understand, I think, that there can be degrees of brain fog, and you can experience them on the same day. So you can go from kind of a mild brain fog where you're just a little bit sluggish in your thinking, have trouble finding words, to more severe brain fog where you lose the ability to speak. It's just all very much on a spectrum. Somebody has done this as a bit of a history on brain fog. It says, brain fog is thought to originate from the term brain fag, a phrase coined in 1850 by a British physician named James Tunstall. Tunstall used the term to describe the mental exhaustion that brain workers, and by that he meant lawyers, writers, teachers, students, what they experienced as a consequence of overstudying. So their brain was just getting exhausted. In the 1960s, brain fag syndrome was actually added to the DSM-4 to describe excessive academic strain. So today, that's still an issue or a cause of brain fog, but it's not the only cause of brain fog. So today, though the common term has changed, brain fog is used to describe symptoms associated with various medical conditions, and we're going to look at those, as well as the consequence of burnout and overwork in modern day society. So let me give you some examples of just various ways that this can show up. So I know a young man who, great business mind, great business potential, and so coming out of university, got jobs, did extremely well in the business world, very sharp mentally, great thinker, great analytical thinker, and so he decided he wanted to go out on his own and be an entrepreneur, start his own business. He had all the skill set, the brain for it, and he got out on his own. And all of a sudden he found he couldn't think. He had trouble making decisions. It was just a terrible, terrible thing for him. It's like his brain shut down. And what he began to realize was he did super well as long as the stress wasn't too great, as long as somebody else was the boss, making the final decisions, carrying the weight and responsibility of the whole organization. As soon as he put himself in that role, the stress became too great and his brain didn't work as well. So that's one example. Another one is a person I know well, and they were going through a very stressful time in their life. And one evening, all of a sudden, their brain got very fuzzy, and then they lost the ability to speak. They just clammed up. They couldn't find words. They couldn't speak. And then the next day, they realized that they'd been watching a movie that evening before, and they couldn't remember anything about that movie. And so they realized it affected their memory as well. So that is another example. A third one from somebody I know. And they wrote this: I have noticed that if I am dealing with a time crunch and I have a lot to do, or I have to do something that I don't like doing, my default, and it's almost imperceptible, it's a mental tape that says, I'm failing or I'm going to fail. I begin to have a super hard time focusing. It's all of a sudden something happens in the brain where they can't concentrate properly. So they tend to jump then from task to task in the middle of what they should be doing. So, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. I especially have a hard time focusing on tasks that require intense thought and focus. Rather, I find myself looking for quick and easy tasks to do, or I catch myself switching to some mindless task. So another example. In early 2016, Juliet Owen Nuttall decided to bake a cake. Now, you have to understand about Juliet Owen Nuttall is she is a trained chef and a former wedding cake decorator. So that was her business. That was her passion for years. She had baked hundreds of cakes before. But in 2016, she went to bake a cake and her mind went blank. She didn't know how to bake a cake. I had forgotten how to do it, she says. I know it sounds really strange, but after the trauma of the last few months, it was like suddenly I no longer had access to any of the knowledge I had built up over the years. So Owen Nuttall, who's 48, wanted to bake to help her decompress after the most stressful period of her life. And it was a dream adventure to relocate to Costa Rica to look after horses on some of the world's most beautiful beaches, but it turned out to be a vicious scam, costing Owen Nuttall and her husband Daniel their life savings and forcing them to live in a small tent on the beach in squalor. The pain and shock caused her brain to shut down entirely. There are only certain bits I remember. When we found out we'd lost everything, I remember starting to feel severely physically ill Then it's all a blur after that. Her memory was shattered. She describes certain periods as blanks marked by forgetfulness and acute loss of basic skills such as baking. It's like your mind has been shrunk down to a single dark corridor. There's nothing outside this corridor and only the basics inside. What Juliet experienced is a common, if rarely articulated phenomenon that occurs during points of high emotional stress, trauma, and often grief. Some people describe it as a fog or a film around reality. Others report chunks of time being severed and lifted from memory or reappearing as fragments. So those are examples just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. Many of you can quickly identify that, yes, you've experienced this. So let me go into the symptoms that people experience with brain fog. And there's a wide variety of symptoms. So you may have some of these, but not all of them. Or you may have some of these at one time and others at a different time. Just a wide variety of symptoms. So for some, when they're going along great in the day, they're mentally sharp, and all of a sudden there's this increased intensity of stress or emotional danger, fear, and their brain goes into this brain fog. They feel a slight dizziness. Others, their mind just goes blank. It's just like their brain is something erased, everything in it. Then they can't think. They know how to think well. They think as their job, but all of a sudden they just can't put two thoughts together. Some, as we said, can't talk. They can't find words that they would commonly use. Others experience almost noise in their brain, static in the brain, like static on a radio. There's just all of a sudden noise in their head, and it makes it hard to hear other people. It's like the TV's on really loud and you're trying to have a conversation with somebody and you can hardly hear them. Others can hear different voices in their head, arguing with them, telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And so it's something has been activated, some part of their brain that now is a critic is talking from there or arguing with them. Others find themselves just very confused all of a sudden, confused about what they're talking about what's been going on. It just, this confusion sets in. Others have trouble grasping concepts or learning when it's something that they normally do very easily and quickly. They're great at grasping concepts quickly and learning quickly, but now they just can't grasp concepts. Others just can't absorb information. They're hearing the information, but they can't absorb it for some reason now like they normally do. Others, all of a sudden, they're forgetting stuff that they need to do. So they have different tasks that they need to complete, and those tasks just are gone from their brain. Others, now a task that would normally take them 5 minutes takes them 20 minutes. It's just all of a sudden very slow, difficult, almost feeling uncoordinated process for them. Others get into a task, but they're just constantly distracted. They just can't stay focused. Others have trouble in a conversation following the conversation. That becomes their issue. Others, they just feel their brain gets sluggish. It's like all of a sudden their brain is trying to walk through thick cement. It's just slow and it takes a lot of work. Others all of a sudden just can't concentrate. They know what they should concentrate on, but their brain can't concentrate. They get sudden ADHD big time. Others get just very sleepy all of a sudden. So it's not like they're just that their brain gets sleepy. It's just it affects them physically as just getting very sleepy. Some even find that their vision starts to get a little bit blurry at these times. Others get disoriented. They all of a sudden don't quite know what's going on here, what's happening here. It's just a very disorienting thing for them. And so it's almost like somebody cast a magic spell on them and they're waking up and going, what's happening here? I don't know where I am. What's going on? Others can't remember anything from what's going on in the moment. So they don't have access to memories. And then what happened in the moment, they can't remember a lot of it later. So they feel almost this surreal feeling that they're not somehow connected to what's going on, to their surroundings. It's almost like they're separate from it, watching it happen to somebody else. Others just constantly lose their train of thought. So they're talking and then bang, they don't know what they're talking about. That happens. Others feel like they're watching as an outsider, something that's happening to somebody else. Some actually get people watching them who begin to wonder, are they drunk? Are they under the influence? Because they're acting weird. They can't even find their words. And so others begin to perceive them as being under the influence. Others, if you're talking along with somebody, but something is said or somebody comments, it just totally derails your train of thought. You can't go back and remember even what you were talking about. Another thing that happens for some is that their conception of time changes in that moment. They lose track of time. They can't process how much time is elapsing when they're in that time. Then another one is, for some, when this happens, they all of a sudden become more emotional than they normally are. They now cry at the drop of a hat. That accompanies this. And then because of all of this, what can happen for so many people is they start to second guess themselves a lot because they know they're not thinking clearly. They know something's going on. So those are symptoms. You can compare yourself to that and see kind of how many of those apply to you. What I want you to hear from that is a lot of people, when they go through this, they just think they're the only one that it's happening to, and they get really down on themselves and think something's wrong with them. Know that you're not alone. This happens to a lot of people. And what we're going to look at now is that this comes out of primarily complex trauma. This is a common complex trauma thing. Now, before we get into that, I need to say that brain fog can be caused by other things. So brain fog can be caused by hormonal changes. So some women in pregnancy go through brain fog. It can also be caused by a change in diet. So some people who change their diet up go through some brain fog because of changes in sugars and stuff in their body. If you abuse alcohol, that can cause brain fog. If you have a new medication, that medication might cause brain fog for you. So there are different things that can cause brain fog. But what I want to focus on is the complex trauma part, because I think it's the main part for most people. And what it really is about, it's the brain's way of trying to help a child survive in very severe trauma. So the child is facing extreme danger. Something that if the child was to look at accurately, if the child was to see clearly, it would be too much, too overwhelming, because the child doesn't have the tools or support to deal with it. So for the brain to let the child process and see this terrible thing accurately would do tremendous damage to the child. So what the brain does to protect that child is to cause brain fog. It causes the child's brain to start shutting down so that they're not able to process everything, to see everything accurately, to protect the child. It's not going to allow the child to go to this very painful, scary, stressful place because the child doesn't have the tools to handle that. What the brain does, and that now we'll go to the kind of the science, the chemicals of that. What the brain does to help is when there's severe stress, severe danger, severe pain, the brain kicks in the sympathetic nervous system And that means it kicks in a shot of cortisol. And cortisol fires up the adrenaline system so that the person now has energy to fight or flight. But cortisol, what happens with cortisol in the brain is it shuts down the cortex. It says we don't have time to think about what to do. We got to get to our brain stem and our limbic system and just react. We have to make a decision to survive, and we got to pick the one that looks like it's going to lead to immediate safety. So let's not weigh out all kinds of options. We got to go into action mode. So that's the design of cortisol. Shut down the thinking, get into the limbic and brainstem so we can act to survive. The problem with complex trauma is that cortisol is pumping all the time. And what we're going to see is that begins to negatively affect the brain, but also when a person gets to adult life, that system, the stress system, can get activated very easily. They're often in it as a default setting. And so cortisol is what causes the brain fog. That's the bottom line. It's about cortisol. But there's one other piece to this. If the danger gets more severe and cortisol's not enabling the child to fight or flight, they're too little, the brain brings in another chemical, natural opioids, and that shuts down things even further. That takes a person to the dorsal vagal system where it puts them into freeze mode. It puts them almost to a catatonic, a dissociative mode, and that sets them up for even greater brain fog. They retreat into an inner world, and their ability to be present and engage the present world kind of disappears. And so two chemicals are working to create brain fog: cortisol and opioids. Now, what's really important for people in recovery to understand is this. So we've been looking at cortisol being produced or opioids being produced because your external circumstances are too painful or stressful, and the brain says, don't have the tools to deal with it, don't have the supports to deal with it, so we have to blur reality so that we protect the person. That's key. But secondly, what can happen is if a person starts to heal and they're going into deeper inner worlds and accessing deeper wounds, the brain might actually say, not ready to go there. To go to that wound would be opening a can of worms that is way too painful. So as they are in the recovery journey starting to heal and they start getting close to a core painful issue, they might actually experience brain fog because their brain is saying, don't want to go there. No, don't think I'm ready to go there. So let's start blurring everything again. So the bottom line is, brain fog is not just about protecting a person from present day stress and pain. It's also about protecting them from hidden pain. So be aware of that in your recovery journey. Now, I want to read to you a bunch of kind of scientific researchers and what they say about cortisol and the brain, just to really drive home what I've said in very general terms. So Staracina, a researcher, says this: things can go particularly awry when it comes to moments of heightened emotional stress or trauma. There's a well-documented effect called the weapon focus effect. If you're held at gunpoint, all your attention is focused on the weapon, the most threatening item on the scene. That hijacks all your attentional resources onto that gun, and it leads to the failure to perceive the rest of the scene. So when there's danger, your brain becomes hyper-focused on the danger, and it just overlooks everything else. So that's one piece. Dr. Chloe Rowland, a clinical psychologist, says this: it's an really interesting function of the brain. Part of your brain, namely the hippocampus, the main memory hub, and the amygdala, the so-called emotion center, basically go offline because of the chemicals like cortisol that are released at the point of intense stress. So you don't fully lay down the memory of what's happening. Then, because the memories are essentially offline, when things begin to come back, they appear to be fragmented. So one result of cortisol is it prevents memories from getting laid down smoothly, and then when you try to recall, it's just pieces and fragments. Dr. Jolene Brighton, a study following a famous cohort called the Framingham Heart Study, found that higher cortisol levels, especially in women, were linked to poor performance in memory, organization, visual perception, and attention. The study comprised over 2,000 participants, primarily in their 40s. Those with higher cortisol levels also were associated with physical alterations to the brain, which became linked to dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Krishnan. So, what's causing the blockage of information in your brain? Well, there's no definitive answer. One idea is that your body's immune system response could cause inflammation in your brain. What causes your body's inflammation response? Stress and cortisol. So, when inflammation occurs, this could cause a temporary blockage in processing information. Brain fog can be caused by chronic stress, hormonal changes, and blood sugar imbalances. Brain fog is a sort of manifestation of some type of inflammation or chronic stress response. Chronic stress can have secondary effects. It impacts your sleep, your nutrition, and your physical ability. Those secondary issues can lead to or be associated with psychiatric disorders. So what we're seeing is all of this cortisol in the brain. It causes brain fog, but it can begin to cause dementia, Alzheimer's, other psychiatric disorders. It is taking its toll on the brain, but then it affects physical stuff, sleep, autoimmune stuff. And we've done a talk on it. It has just got a profound negative effect. Suppress cortisol. Several other studies have noted that cortisol impacts brain volume in regions known to affect cognition, including gray matter, which is vital for processing information, and the hippocampus, which is essentially for memory. So long-term effects of cortisol, it affects the brain's volume, how big the brain is in certain areas, and that can then cause that you slide into brain fog much more easily than a other person would. I found it interesting just to kind of back away from this and look at, okay, we're looking at cortisol, and we're looking at cortisol and brain fog, but just so you're aware, what else does high cortisol levels do? So it's connected to anxiety, depression, and irritability. It's connected to muscle weakness, fatigue, and sleep problems. When there's a lot of cortisol happening, people can either get weight gain or unexplained weight loss. It can go either way for them. Some, when there's ongoing cortisol happening, it changes their skin. So there's a thinning of the skin, they easily bruise, there's stretch marks that easily happen. It definitely affects your whole digestive system, so you have digestive issues, irritable bowel, diarrhea, constipation, Crohn's disease, nausea, all of that, excessive cortisol. Then high blood pressure, headaches, memory problems, and then brain fog. So this cortisol issue is just massive. Aaron Tribby says this: if you ever felt like stress affects the way you think, here's some of the few consequences of high cortisol levels on the brain. So the amygdala, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex are the most affected areas of the brain by cortisol. Together, they control your emotions, your learning, your memory, your executive function, and decision making. So cortisol is going to affect all of those negatively, and that's what we've been looking at. Then you have mild cognitive impairment, which is sometimes a precursor to dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and again connected to elevated cortisol levels. Or overexposure to cortisol can kill off brain cells, and so smaller brain volume. HPA activity, which is your response to stress, has been linked, which releases cortisol, has been linked to more rapid decline in patients with Alzheimer's disease. Now, I need to just add one piece here. So what we've looked at is that one of the brain's responses when a child is facing something very scary is to shut down the brain. But there are other responses that they become their go-to more than brain fog, or there might be a blend of brain fog plus these other ways of coping. So let me just give them to you. So a person, when they're facing something very scary, very stressful, all of a sudden they just want to change the subject. They don't want to talk about it anymore. They want to talk about something else. So that's their way of kind of diverting the brain's attention to something less stressful. Or they might want to just go do something else. So they need a distraction. They need to get away from that circumstance and go find something else to do. So that's why people all of a sudden want to do a mindless, numbing task. They can think of all kinds of little jobs they'd like to do just to distract themselves. Others, when they're in a very painful situation and the topic is scary or stressful, they divert attention of everybody else from the topic onto themselves. And they go, look at me, and here's what's going on in my life. And all of a sudden, if I can be the center of attention, then the painful topic isn't the center of attention. Others, as soon as the topic is getting too painful, they can't sit still. They get extremely agitated. They got to get up. They got to move. Their foot starts dancing because the pressure is building inside. And sometimes they'll get angry, get very irritable, and lash out at people. That's their way of trying to avoid that topic. So those are just some other things that can happen for people. So let's go to the healing part of this brain fog issue. So what I hope you see is that if you are in a brain fog, it's because there's a lot of stress going on below the surface. So the real issue is the too much stress. The brain fog is a symptom. So the danger is to think, I just need to fix the symptom. If you try to fix the symptom without fixing the real issue, which is there's too much stress in your life right now, you're never really going to fix the brain fog. So understand the real issue is the stress. Brain fog is the symptom. Now, there's going to be some things we can do to help with that symptom in the moment, but the key thing is you have to begin to look at the stress of your life. That's the key problem. That's what's got to get attention. That's what's got to change. That's what's got to get fixed. So if you have a brain fog and you're usually extremely mentally sharp, quick, people look up to you because of how smart you are, how good you are at thinking, and now you have a brain fog, part of the temptation for you is going to be to get down on yourself, go to shame, beat yourself up, to get worried that something's wrong with you. Don't go there. Realize, okay, this is a stress thing. What's causing the stress? So ground yourself and then explore. What is causing the stress that has produced the brain fog? So there's nothing wrong with my brain. My brain is working just fine. I don't need to go to shame. It has gone to a protective survival strategy that it had to do in childhood because of too much stress. So it's doing the same thing today. So explore what is the stress that is going on. Now, what I want you to see from all of this is, to me, when a person comes out of complex trauma, A stressful life has been their normal. It's their default setting. It feels comfortable. That's where they've been all their life. Their sympathetic has been much more busy than their parasympathetic. And so for them in recovery, it's very, very easy for them to slide back into a life that is too stressful, but they don't even realize it because that's been their normal. And so stress doesn't show up on their radar until it's a 9 or 10 out of 10 in severity. If it's a 3, 4, or 5, they don't even notice that they're stressed because, well, that's not that bad. That's kind of normal. And so part of what you have to do to help brain fog is to become more mindful of your stress on a daily basis, of what's causing your stress and of preventing stress from growing. Because if it grows, you may not notice it when it's a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You may not start noticing that you're stressed until it's an 8 or 9, but often then it's too late. And then you're in big trouble. So learn to spot stress early on and the early warning signs of stress. But more than that, to deal with stress, to not have unnecessary stress, we have to begin to realize that if I'm not meeting all my 12 needs properly, and there's a need that's not being met, that's adding stress to my brain. That's adding stress to my system. So it is so important to have a balanced life where I do healthy self-care and learn to meet all of my 12 needs. Secondly, I need to learn the daily practice of stopping to take an inventory several times a day and go, where's my stress at? And not just be looking for 7, 8, 9, and 10, but looking for subtle 2, 3, 4, and 5s that you can learn to spot. So it's stopping and paying attention, being mindful of what's going on in your body, what's going on in your emotions, thinking about all of the responsibilities you have right now and how it's affecting you. Then, if you don't learn healthy boundaries, if you don't learn to say no to certain people, if you don't stop people pleasing, you're never going to deal with your stress properly. You're always going to have too much stress. So it's absolutely essential. If you're going to deal with brain fog, you got to deal with stress, which means you got to learn to set healthy boundaries. Then, for many people, it's learning practical daily tools to help them reduce stress, to get out of their sympathetic to their parasympathetic nervous systems so they can heal and rest and relax. So meditation, learning to do daily meditation can help them. Learning to use music, art therapy, pet therapy, some other somatic therapy that can help calm you down, reduce the stress in your life, get your vagus nerve to a healthier place so that you're able to deal with stress better. So it's learning very practical tools. Part of that is learning to self-soothe in healthy ways. So we are going to get triggered. We are going to have events happen that heighten our stress all of a sudden. We need to learn to ground, to self-soothe ourselves in that moment. So talking to somebody, going for a walk, doing yoga, whatever helps you in those moments. I think it's so important for people when they're trying to manage their stress, reduce their overall stress, understand their stress, is to realize that often we produce stress not because of external circumstances, but because of faulty internal messages. We still have a shame belief that we're going to fail. We're not good enough. People are going to reject us. We can't do anything right. And those lies, those distortions, those shame messages heighten our stress. Others, they continually compare themselves with others because of their shame and always think that others are better than themselves. Or they set the unrelenting standards, bar too high for themselves, and they try to be perfect. They try to do everything, and that just causes them to get too stressed. So you've got all kinds of old internal systems that were originally thought by the brain that they would solve your shame and make your life better, but now they're actually adding to your stress and making life more difficult. One final thing. In the moment, when you are going through kind of a brain fog, like we said, don't beat yourself up. But what sometimes can happen is realize I can do some things that help ground me a little bit. So you may need to just kind of step out of the room for a little bit, do some deep breathing, some grounding exercises, get yourself out of your limbic brain, back into your cortex. If you can find little things like that that will help you kind of in that 5-10 minutes to get out of the situation, get grounded, then it can really help you just to get back to a better place. But don't stop and think that that's all you need to do. What you then need to do is, okay, I got through this situation. Now I need to go home and figure out, what am I going to do about I got too much stress in my life? What boundaries do I need to set? What do I need to do about what's going on in my internal world that's adding to the stress? And you need to begin to figure out how to improve that part of your life. That's the key thing. So that's brain fog. Hopefully, again, you'll walk away from this with greater insight and you won't be beating yourself up. You'll see what the real issue is and have a practical guide for how to move forward in helping deal with the real issue. So that's the end of another Friday night. Thank you for being here. Have a great